Okay, welcome everyone to the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. My name's Anthony Costello. And today we're going to be talking about the new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, with our good friend, Dr. Ed Echeverria. Ed Echeverria is a professor of philosophy and systematic theology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit, Michigan. Ed holds a doctorate in philosophy from the Free University in Amsterdam and a licentiate or licentiate, if I'm using the old Latin.
Just licentiate. It's very
Licentiate?
simple.
Okay.
Licentiate in sacred theology from the
From
University
St.
of
Thomas
St.
in
Thomas.
Rome.
The
Now, wait,
Angelican.
Ed, before I continue with your publications and bio, doesn't the new Pope get the same degree from
Well, he
St.
has
Thomas in Rome?
an STD, a doctorate in sacred theology from the Angelicum, which is where I got my STL.
Okay, so you guys are colleagues,
Well,
essentially.
he got
academic
his degree, some years ago. Yes, in canon law at
Right.
the Pontifical University of St. Thomas. The order that he's an Augustinian, so the
Yeah.
order that he belonged to sent him, and he was only 27 then. He was sent by the superiors of the Augustinian, the
Right.
order, to Rome to do his STD, his doctorate in sacred theology. But his name is Robert Francis Prevost, and he was born in 1955. He's pretty young. I mean, by
Papal standards.
papal standards. I mean, although John Paul II was only 57 when he became Pope.
Oh,
So
even younger.
he was
very
Pope
young.
for
Right.
27 years. He was born in Chicago.
Was he born in Chicago or I saw some adult in Illinois? So it's interesting for me when we heard the announcement, and I just caught it online because I am from Chicago. So I think for a lot of people, as we get it just quick, like for a lot of people, like you're from Chicago, it's the idea of like, hey, the Pope is from Chicago.
Yeah, well,
it's just sort of like shocking. I mean, we always expect the Pope to be from some, I don't know, to say exotic, because most popes obviously
from
are
Italy,
from Europe, but they're European.
Francis was from Argentina.
He was Argentinian.
Ratzinger was from Germany.
And I was living in Germany when Ratzinger was selected. So that was kind of interesting,
right?
Because all my German friends were, surprised and shocked.
And John Paul II was from Poland,
yeah,
and so on. And then really the previous history, maybe I forget where the exception was, but they were all Italians,
Right.
But
right. There were just a handful of exceptions to that sort of rule.
He was actually, according to the Vatican, the Vatican's account of his biography, he was born on September 14th, 1955 in Chicago, Illinois.
Yeah.
To Louis Marius Prevost of French and Italian descent, and his mother Mildred Martinez of Spanish descent. He has two brothers. They've been on the news.
Yeah, they've been on the news. Yeah, maybe we'll talk about that a little bit.
He studied at Villanova University in Pennsylvania, where in 1977 he earned a degree in mathematics and also studied philosophy. In 1977, in September, he entered the novitiate, as it's called, of the Order of St. Augustine in St. Louis. And he took, you have to go through various stages. First profession of vows, which he took in 1978, and then he made his solemn vows on August 29, 1981. Then, as I said, he studied at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And when he was 27, he was sent by the Augustinians to study for his doctorate in canon law at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum, as it's called. He was ordained a priest on June 1982, at the Augustinian College of St. Monica. And there's a whole history. He was actually involved in the Augustinian mission in Peru, which he went back to often, spent actually quite a number of years there. Now, his doctoral thesis, somewhat esoteric for me, but someone might say the same thing. My doctoral thesis was on contemporary theories of rationality. His doctoral thesis was on the role of the local prior in the order of St. Augustine.
Okay, wait. So the row, what is
The role, R-O-L-E,
the role of the
of the local
prior
prior. The prior is the head of the local order.
of the
So,
local
for
order?
instance, when I would go,
Okay, okay,
if I would go to, and I went several times to the Blackfriars Dominican order, either in Cambridge or in Oxford. In Oxford, no, it was in Cambridge. There was the Priory of the Immaculate Conception and so there was someone. It's like he's the head
right,
man there, and so
yeah.
that he's called the prior, and so
That was the so. I mean, a work on practical theology and
right, but
uh,
canonical canon law.
right,
So
right,
the role
okay.
of the role of the local prior. So Cambridge had a prior,
Mm-hmm.
Oxford had a prior for Dominican order, Blackfriar
Right.
Dominicans, and so on. And then he was appointed vocation director and missions director of the Augustinian province of the Mother of Good Counsel in Olympia Fields in Illinois. And then a lot of what follows was his missionary work in Peru, uh, and so on. And he was there for about 11 years. He was prior of the community there, formation director, instructor for professed members. And eventually he also taught at the seminary there, a professor of canon law, patristics, and moral theology. This is already more education than Francis ever had, because Francis never did his doctorate. No, he started a doctorate. I forget what year he started a doctorate on the great Italian uh, uh, theologian philosopher Romano Guardini, but he never finished that. Um, in 2013, he returned to his Augustinian province in Chicago, again serving as director of formation at the St. Augustine Convent. All of that, and then uh, he was actually appointed bishop. Went back to Peru. Pope Francis appointed him bishop of Chicleo. I'm not sure I pronounced that well, but um, and then in 2019, Francis appointed him a member of the Congregation for the Clergy, and in 2020, a member of the Congregation for Bishops. And then eventually, in 2023, the Pope called him to Rome to serve as the prefect of the Congregation for Bishops. So the Congregation for Bishops, so for instance, in the United States, we just had in the Detroit Archdiocese, we have a new archbishop. The previous Archbishop Vigneron, he turned 75. When you turn 75, you have to submit your resignation.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it's up to the Pope to determine when he wants to, if he accepts it, when he wants to accept it, etc. So we have a new Archbishop, and the it's a complicated process of appointments. but the apostolic nuncio to the United States, so that's like the ambassador, the Vatican ambassador to the United States, he gets all kinds of recommendations, for this guy, that guy, the other guy, and then that's sent to Rome to the Congregation for Bishops, and there are several people such as Supich, Cardinal Supich, the Lord help us, Cardinal Supich, who belongs to that congregation, and several other. And so, what's his name? Then it was Cardinal Prevost. He was actually the prefect for that congregation. So he was like the head dude for that congregation.
Okay.
And that was in 2023, and so on and so on. And then, as we know, there were all kinds of little things that he did along the way while he was in Rome. And then, of course, I honestly, I never heard of him.
Well, this is, yeah. So, I mean, when we spoke right after Francis's death, right?
Right.
And I think, we mentioned a couple of
Cardinal
people
Muller,
who were in the front
German
running,
cardinal.
who were on the radar, so to say.
Right.
And,
Cardinal Sarah from Africa.
Sarah from Africa. I think
Cardinal Muller. There was another
Erdo from
Cardinal
Hungary's
Eitz
name,
from the Netherlands,
and that Pizza Bala and others.
I never heard of him either. So
yeah,
I don't know.
But their names were being mentioned quite often.
Right.
So I think that it was just there was this sort of initial. Now, let me ask you this. Let's walk it back to when Francis was elected. Was Bergoglio?
Didn't know him either.
He wasn't known either, right? He was
No,
sort of a surprise
not really.
as well.
No.
So, I mean, this is not probably unprecedented that you'd get a surprise.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
Look,
right.
Let me put it this way to you. I knew who I didn't want.
Right, who you didn't want. But even if you didn't want somebody, you might have thought this is still somebody who's probably got a good chance at being selected for whatever reasons.
Well, there was Parolin, who was the Secretary
Italian,
of State.
Yeah.
Under Francis.
Now we are speaking of this to some sense without reference to the work of the Holy Spirit.
Well, right. We're just talking it from a purely human standpoint here.
So I understand.
We're not talking about how does the work of God figure into this and so on. So there were popes, there were candidates that were talked about that I knew I didn't want, but none of the ones that I wanted, like Cardinal Muller from Germany or even Sarah. Although Leo has appointed Sarah to be a kind of a, not sure exactly what that involves, but a kind of a universal ambassador for the church. So
interesting.
But I mean, I'm positive. Actually, honestly, I'm positive. I think I like him. He seems like a very, what do you say? He seems like a very nice person, personable,
genuine,
affable
kind of personality,
all that kind of stuff.
I mean, there was. It is again. Go back to just the Rod Dreher after the selection of Prevost. Wrote an article called Pope Bob from Chicago, which, is kind of, again, it was, when I saw it, I immediately texted my whole family, we're all from the South Side of Chicago. We got a big family from the South Side of Chicago. I'm not Catholic anymore. As you know, I'm Protestant, but my whole family's Roman Catholic. My brother used to work for the diocese under Cardinal George. At the time, my family's very informed about the Catholic world, in the Chicago area especially, and they said like nobody had heard anything. Now he did spend a lot of that time in Peru overseas in his missionary work. I understand that, but yeah, so certainly an underdog or a dark horse in that sense that people are like. Even people from Chicago were like, we don't know. Never heard of
Right.
this guy. But what do you
Yeah.
think? I mean,
Go
do
ahead.
you think, as far as being the first American pope, I mean, do you think this has any great significance for the Roman Catholic Church? Um, do you think that there was some consideration of trying to have somebody from the United States? Does that play into the selection in any way, or what do you think?
Honestly, I don't really know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there was. I remember Cardinal. What's his name from New York? Cardinal Dolan said, "Oh no, they would never elect an American
Yeah,
because
why is that? Because I heard several people say that an American pope, I want to say even Francis, there was somebody quoted Francis George saying that an American pope will never be selected until, I don't know, it had to do with, I want to say like with the status of America in the world. That,
right.
but is there something to that? Why people
Well,
thought you could never?
I don't really know. I can tell you. I mean, Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, didn't he didn't like the United States.
Mhm.
In my opinion, he was even recently he wrote some letter or some. I don't think it was. I don't know what kind of authority it had, but he wrote a letter criticizing, the Trump administration on immigration and was made some critical remarks about J.D. Vance. About who knows. I just want to. My concern now is my concern now is what's the direction? What is
Yeah.
he going to tell us? I don't think that he's I don't think that he's a kind of a Francis 2.0.
Hmm.
Although I have Facebook friends who it's silly, but I have Facebook friends who every time he says something, they'll say, "You see, it's Francis. He's just
They're
standing in."
concerned. They're concerned
No,
that
no,
he's
they're
like a
not
friend.
concerned. They
Oh,
think this is
they're
fundamentally important.
pleased. Yeah,
They
they're
think that
pleased.
he's just
Yes.
like
Yeah.
if he mentions Francis, you see, he's mentioning Francis, and so on and so on.
Right.
So let me give you an example of that. I have a column coming out in the Catholic thing, um, and it addresses the question whether, um, and if so, in what sense, was traditional marriage, conjugal marriage, as we call it, whether it was undermined by the Pope Francis papacy. And because Pope Leo has said things like, for instance, that the family is founded on the stable union of a man and a woman, and so on. There are plenty of, and he says that this is not something that's man made. It's grounded in the
Hmm.
order of creation, and so
Creation.
on and so on. Uh, I, I say I've been struck by the response of what I'm calling the knockers and the boosters of Pope Francis' view of conjugal marriage. So you have those people on the one hand who think that when Leo says this about marriage, that marriage is a two in one flesh union, man and woman, that it presupposes sexual differentiation as a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh, they think that Leo is saying something that Francis denied. And then, of course, on the other hand, you have those who say it's just a continuity. There's no discontinuity here between the two. And I say in this column that I've written, I say that the knockers of Francis are wrong. Um, throughout his pontificate, throughout his pontificate, Francis consistently taught, even though it wasn't in the limelight, because you'd hear more about environmental issues and climate, whatever, from him But he taught consistently the conjugal view of marriage. Marriage is the two in one flesh union between a man and a woman, and sexual differentiation is a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh. In this respect, he stood in line with John Paul II and Benedict and so on, affirming the moral and sacramental significance of the two in one flesh bodily unity as foundational to the marital form of love, and so on and so on. So there are all kinds of places. It's in his apostolic exhortations, Evangelii Gaudium, that's affirmed. In Amoris Laetitia, that's affirmed, even though that's, I think, a controverted encyclical. And also in the encyclical Laudato Si, that's also affirmed. So the knockers are wrong. Those people...
Those knocking Francis
on marriage.
As if he had changed.
As if he didn't think that marriage was a two in one flesh union, man and woman.
Against the doctrine, right?
Yeah, he
never did that. Yeah, we've talked about that several times.
Yeah, that's utterly wrong. On the other hand,
but at the same time, yes,
the boosters are wrong.
Yeah,
because despite Francis' affirmation of conjugal marriage, I identify 5 different things that actually contributed to the perception that he was undermining conjugal marriage. One of them was, of course, that he was an advocate of legal support of same-sex civil unions.
Yeah.
Doesn't the advocacy of such unions, which has sinful acts at its core, constituting the union, corrupt the good of human nature and hence the culture of marriage? Secondly, it's beyond me, but in an interview that he did, I wrote a column on this as well in the Catholic Thing a few months, well, maybe last year. Anyway, in an interview he did, he of course always made it clear that a same-sex civil union is not marriage. So he rejected identifying the two. But then he said that homosexual experience has the gift of love. And I say, implying thereby that homosexual quote-unquote love is not an inherently disordered form of love. It's an inherently disordered form of love. That's classical, historic Christian teaching.
It's just Augustinian, Christian.
An offense against chastity, the Catechism says.
Yeah. Does
he think that the homosexual is able to live the vocation to chastity and hence of love in a same-sex relationship, and so on and so on? I think that also contributed to the misperception.
Right.
And it wasn't just a misperception, because if you affirm that the homosexual experience of love as a gift, then there was also, we talked about this, the allowance of the controverted practice of same-sex blessings legitimized in the Declaration Fiducia Supplicans. So remember, I say the Declaration died the death of 1,000 qualifications. It went from the blessing of a union to a couple, and finally an individual. Pope Francis, when he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, Nora O'Donnell, I think her name is, she said, so the church is now blessing same-sex unions, and the Pope said, no, we're not doing that, he says. We're blessing individuals. And then I say, regardless, and I quote here the English Catholic philosopher John Finnis, he says, there is no crucial moral or pastoral difference between A, blessing people who happen to be sinners, and B, blessing people as parties to a relationship expressed in sinful acts. It seems to me that those are identical. And then so that also contributed to people thinking, and it does in fact contribute to the undermining of conjugal marriage. And so it did contribute to the perception that Francis doesn't support conjugal marriage. Fourth, Francis attempts to carve out a moral space for the divorced and civilly remarried to receive communion in Amoris Laetitia. on this view, the moral law ceases to have an obligatory force, and it only has an aspiring force. These are people who treat the moral law as simply an ideal, something to strive after, as opposed to treating it as such having an obligatory force. And then there's the confusion between the law of gradualness and the gradualness of the law. The law of gradualness, everybody accepts the law of gradualness. That is to say, the moral life is something, the life of virtue is something that takes time.
Sanctification, the process of being
it takes time, exactly.
It's over the lifetime.
But at the same time, we say, I always quote 1 John, the first chapter, the 9th verse, if you confess your sins, he is faithful and just to forgive your sins and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness.
Right.
So there is moral progress, moral development there.
Yeah.
And as you sin along the way, you go to confession, etc. That's confused with the gradualness of the law, and the gradualness of the law is that the moral law is going to be situation and person specific, so that I remember once I wrote a thing on the Archbishop of Chicago, Supich. The idea is that you're striving to do the best that you can. And what you're doing now is incompatible with the moral law, with the objectivity of the moral law, with its obligatory force. And then the priest says to you, Tony, you're doing the best that you can. Not to worry. Just keep striving after the realization of what the moral law is, and how you're living your life right now is a person and situation specific manifestation of the moral law in its fullness, and so long as you're striving to do the best that you can, and in fact, I remember Supich saying, you have these people who he was talking about homosexuals who are living in a homosexual relationship, and they're trying to do the best that they can, and so on.
Yeah.
So the law becomes it's not the gradual,
tailored to the individual's circumstance.
And exactly.
It's a customized moral law.
It's like saying, remember from 2 Corinthians, where Paul says, 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, be reconciled to God, you're a new creation and all of that, be reconciled to God. It's like those people who say, well, be reconciled to God according to what's possible for you given
your circumstances and conditions, your personal
life.
Psychology, and
whatever you can't right now. You can't change your life, and blah blah blah. So Francis's logic, in my judgment, in that book, in that encyclical of pastoral reasoning, is such that the morally permissible choice is made under a lesser of two evils. Moral calculus, you see.
We might have to do a whole nother podcast just on this moral theological issue, because about a year and a half ago, I was studying Pascal a lot, but not just the Ponce. I was looking at the provincial letters, and in the provincial letters, he's engaging with these Jesuit theologians. Now, this is the early 17th century, but they've developed this kind of graduated view of the law, where the law is graded according and tailored and customized according to the cultural, the personal psychological conditions of the sinner. And Pascal is like going back and forth with these Jesuit fathers, and he kind of thinks they're crazy, because there's even one of the letters where, like, murdering somebody could be okay if it's in the context of this honor shame culture of 17th century France, where the nobleman is offended in some way, and because of the honor shame culture being such a powerful force at the time in that place, that the nobleman could duel with the person who's offended and kill him, and that might be sort of okay in that context. Yeah, it's like, oh my goodness, and like we're not. I mean, fast forward to the present day, it's we probably wouldn't think dueling somebody to
No, no,
death
no.
would
The
be okay,
church is against dueling.
but
It's
the
always
issues
been
have just
against dueling.
shifted to now the sexual issues,
Well,
and
Francis's Amoris Laetitia, and I always say, um, if there was no chapter 8 in Amoris Laetitia where he tries to carve out a, even the way I'm saying it, some people object to my putting it this way, where he tries to carve out a moral justification for the divorce and civilly remarry to receive a communion. If that chapter didn't exist, I don't think anybody would care about Amoris Laetitia. It would be certain
that
parts of
was
it.
the controversial
That
piece.
chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, because that's the chapter where he's trying to lay out a moral and pastoral logic for, providing a justification for the divorce and civilly remarry to receive communion. Now, whatever the case may be about that logic, the fact is it contributed to the perception that traditional marriage was being undermined. Because, I mean, the church doesn't, if you look back at Benedict and John Paul II's also a post-synodical apostolic exhortation in 84, Familiaris Consortio, where he lays out family, marriage, all this kind of stuff. So, and the last thing that I think contributed to this issue, the question, or the perception in people's minds that Francis was undermining conjugal marriage and so on, was the Pope's support for same-sex ministries, such as the infamous, Father James Martin, who presupposes the legitimacy of homosexual identity and his openness to morally problematic relationships. That's another thing. The Pope's openness to the morally problematic relationships such as cohabitation. Regarding Father Martin, you'd have to. It's beyond me that you could actually, it's one thing to say, look, I'm talking to Father Martin, the Pope says, but we're doing it in private. He's coming to my office. We're talking about what he's trying to do with, homosexuals, lesbians, blah, 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 blah. But no, he would take photos with these people. He would take photos with Father James Martin. He would take photos with this other woman, Sister Gramick, who was actually censured during the pontificate of John Paul II. She was involved with New Ways Ministry, which is a pro-homosexual organization. So that also, I've written about this. I have a book coming out.
And I mean, maybe we should point this is not just like reaching out pastorally to people who are same-sex attracted, and this is like where you're getting to you're endorsing, right? There's an endorsing.
You're fearfully and wonderfully made.
Yeah.
However you're made, you see.
Right.
He wrote a book called Building Bridges.
Who did? Francis or
no, Father Martin.
Martin, yeah.
Building Bridges between the Catholic Church and the LGBT community.
Right.
And I discuss him along with others I have a book coming out on redeeming sex. It's volume 1 of I've written it's going to be it's a 3-volume work, and the first volume is on redeeming sex, the battle for the body, and I discuss in the last part of the book, 2 chapters, I discuss the that kind of ministry of James
Well, those
Martin.
ministries of building bridges, they're usually one-way bridges,
Oh yeah, no, well, no, it's true. It's true.
as my friend would
The
point
other
out.
the other aspect. Well, someone like Martin and others, they think that homosexuality is somehow a creational given, rather than being an inherently disordered condition. They think it's somehow creational. So I don't know
Right,
why.
right,
I don't know
right.
why the Pope would. But again, that contributed in the mind of many people. Oh, the Pope, he clearly, even though he would say one thing
Yeah.
repeatedly throughout his pontificate about marriage, conjugal marriage, etc., and then he'd do this kind of stuff, and people would say, "Well, what's going on here?"
But to bring it back to Leo or Prevost, we don't, there's no sense that we have, certainly not before his selection. And what has it
No,
been,
and he
a
said,
month now? Where there's no sense he's going to be carrying on in that
no.
confusion.
In fact,
That
he said
Francis
he's
unleashed.
quoted in a certain passage where he particularly affirmed that there's an antithesis between the Bible, the Christian life, Catholic moral teaching, and he was using the phrase at that time, homosexual lifestyles and these alternative family arrangements.
Right.
So if he sticks with that, which in my judgment is the teaching of the Church, then of course that's another aspect of he's not gonna confuse us at the end of, I'd say, a lot of other things in this column, but at the end, well, it is also baffling. There was Francis, he encouraged pastoral practice in which people who prefer to live together without being married are welcome into the Church as cohabiting couples.
With no sort of engagement.
Well, they were. If you're welcome into the Church as cohabiting
sinful
couples, then
act,
I don't see where the engagement would be.
Yeah, no pastoral engagement. Okay.
Where is the illuminating truth expressed in the moral norm prohibiting fornication in the Catechism and all its consequences that offend the dignity of marriage, of family, and weakening the sense of conjugal chastity? Why don't we hear, and you would never hear this from Francis, you see, why don't we hear, here's the Catechism, the sexual act must take place exclusively within marriage. Outside of marriage, it always constitutes a grave sin and excludes one from sacramental communion.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't said. Anyway,
go ahead.
I was going to say the bottom line is that these 5 things that I've mentioned fail to take into account the unprecedented threats in our time against the Christian doctrine of sexual ethics.
Yeah.
Anyway, so all of that, so then I just conclude by saying, after a few other things I say, Pope Leo XIV must dispel the confusion in Francis' teaching by reclaiming the doctrine of sexual ethics of the Church.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in my view, I don't, given several things that he's said already, I don't think that he's going to be, a clone of Pope Francis.
So we don't think he'll be Francis 2.0. Now,
No.
Do you think that he might just be more reserved and maybe silent on certain issues?
Well, that's possible.
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean,
it's hard to say,
totally speculating.
But here's my approach.
As you've pointed out, I mean, he doesn't. Maybe we should point this out to the audience. There's not a lot of writing.
No, there's no
Leo
history. There's no textual,
prior to his selection.
Exactly. It's not like I said. It's not like John Paul II, Karl Wojtyła, who before he became Pope had a vast
writing on all kinds of theological and philosophical issues.
Exactly.
Got the one dissertation on the role of the prior in the Augustinian
in the local
tradition. Local Augustinian chapter.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, but here's my thing. I say let's approach Leo the 14th. Um, I'm not looking for. I certainly am not looking for everything that comes out of his mouth to be affirming Francis, because there's too
Hmm.
much confusion in my judgment in Francis.
Yeah.
But neither am I. Um, neither am I saying, oh, you know, it's all cool. Nothing to worry about. I don't know. I'm positive.
Right.
I'm cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic. Hmm.
He's there are several, like for instance, um, he did he did put out. He's written in the last couple of weeks several things. There was and this one thing. He addressed the members. This was last Saturday. He addressed the members of the Centesimus Annus Foundation, the Centesimus Annus Foundation. Leo the 13th, in 1891, wrote the encyclical uh, that that John Paul II, 100 years later, um, was commemorating with an encyclical called Centesimus Annus.
Was
A
that
hundred
the
years.
was the okay? So Leo the 13th. So obviously, I'm. Let me ask this question in advance, because again, for people who are watching this, like they might. I mean, there might be one question they'd be wondering is why pick the name Leo, right? So I mean, is the idea there that he's probably taking that pontifical title in reference to the previous Leo the 13th, and
Well, it
then we
could be
look
the
at so kind of
Leonine
like look,
tradition as such, all the way
yeah,
from the beginning. I mean,
right.
Leo,
I
from the
mean, there's been
beginning, Leo was in.
13. I don't. They can't all be equally good. Of course, Leo the First is obviously Leo the Great in history,
Right,
right?
right,
And
exactly. So,
um,
Leo the 13th, um, in fact, once he took when once Cardinal Prevost took the name Leo, I actually ordered a copy of Leonine encyclicals. So, in just the encyclicals, there are about 20 some odd encyclicals on a range of topics. Uh, on ecumenism, on the state, on Christian democracy, on freedom, etc., etc. Rerum Novarum is the encyclical that's often referred to, and which John Paul II in
these are
Centesimus.
Leo the 13th's
Yes, these are all Leo the
encyclicals.
13th.
Yeah.
Rerum Novarum was an encyclical that dealt with the question of labor, of capital, of the
Okay.
social conditions, moral conditions of the worker, and so on. He also wrote, which I was actually going to write a column on, but I got distracted by these people who were just trying to emphasize, oh, you see, he's just like Francis.
Hmm.
So, but it was an encyclical called Testem Benevolentia Nostre. So, and this had to do with Leo's critique of what he in that encyclical called Americanism.
Mm.
And basically, the
So 1890s, right? Leo
this was
13th,
yeah
turn
this
almost the
actually
turn of
this was
the 20th
actually that
century.
encyclical. Testem Benevolentia Nostrum. That's an 1899 encyclical.
Wow, right. Okay, right at the turn of the
Yeah, right.
century.
So he's
Modernism is
criticizing the
sort of
way
at its
that
height.
Catholics.
Yeah.
He's criticizing the way that Catholics are engaging culture and being assimilated by the culture. And
Leo
so,
the 13th wrote the treatise or the encyclical on isn't it just called on modernism or modernity? I
no,
know was it.
that comes after.
Oh, okay, okay,
That comes after. See, Leo the 13th was a pope until 1903, I believe,
okay.
and then after that you have Pius X and Pius XI, and so you have a critique of modernism, um, and actually a kind of a summation of what's the core of modernism, and then he has an encyclical that deals with modernism, and that sort of follows the line of Leo the 13th. So but the Pope Leo XIV, was addressing a society that took its name from John Paul II's 1991 encyclical, Centesimus Annus, which also deals with, so 100 years after, that's what Centesimus Annus deals with, means in English. And John Paul II was trying to give an account of, well, where are we now, culturally, morally, societally, not just on questions of labor, but on the role of the state. And also in that encyclical, he deals with the question of, capitalism and a market economy versus a top-down economy, and what's the anthropology behind a free market system? It's actually quite a marvelous encyclical, and so Leo XIV was addressing this society. It's well worth reading the essay, his address.
Okay, so this was just in the last week or so.
Yeah.
that he
On
did this?
Saturday, the 17th
Yeah.
of May, he was addressing, and it's actually quite good. It's actually quite a good,
Address.
and and he's laying out what he thinks the church's social doctrine is. You know, okay, so I read something like that, and then in my mind, I immediately go to the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. If you've ever read that, that's a fantastic. That's a fantastic catechism, as it were. But it lays out the nature of the church's social doctrine. Just to quote you a few sentences, he says that this compendium says the church's social doctrine is therefore of a theological nature, specifically theological moral, since it is a doctrine aimed at guiding people's behavior. And the compendium says that there are 3 levels of theological moral teaching: the foundational level of motivation, the directive level of norms for life in a society, and then the deliberative level of conscience's call to mediate objective and general norms, and so on. So there's a whole, foundation, extensive account of what the church's social doctrine is. Now, Leo XIV obviously felt the need to address this to the. He doesn't get into all the systematic and analytic elements of it, but it's a good
But
document.
it's a defense or a
Yeah.
reaffirmation
Although
of
here again,
yeah,
these individuals who were just, they're looking for things that somehow will
anything
say,
right.
"Oh, you see, that's Francis." At one point, Leo XIV says, he's trying to provide a justification for what doctrine is in the context of social doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, indoctrination is immoral. It stifles critical judgment and undermines the sacred freedom of conscience, even if erroneous. It resists new notions and rejects movement, change, or the evolution of ideas in the face of new problems. Doctrine, on the other hand, as a serious, serene, and rigorous discourse, aims to teach us primarily how to approach problems and, even more importantly, how to approach people. It also helps us to make prudential judgments when confronted with challenges. Seriousness, rigor, and serenity are what we learn from every doctrine, including the Church's social doctrine. Now, one guy, when Leo said indoctrination is immoral,
He
he said,
latched onto that part of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
You see, Leo
Yeah.
is saying that he's against proselytizing.
Right.
Francis was big on the church is against proselytizing. sometimes he never distinguished between proselytizing and
Evangelizing. Yeah.
and sometimes proselytizing meant that you weren't allowed to engage in apologetics, such that you're trying to persuade this an individual that his view is actually false, wrong,
Right. Right.
that he's not justified in holding the beliefs that he holds.
You have to give up the claim to absolute truth.
Remember, I told you that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you have to
Because
give up that claim.
I know. Well, that's
when you're
preposterous,
engaging
of
with the
course.
non-believer or the co-religionist.
Exactly. That's
right.
preposterous, of course. So you have to. I'm listening. I'm gonna listen to Pope Leo the 14th. I'm not going to be running like this guy who ran and said, "Oh, you see, he's against indoctrination." He's against indoctrination because it doesn't allow the individual to develop a critical judgments. It's like when
and to make an actual assent.
Right,
exactly. To the theological claims.
And that there are reasons for making.
Right.
It's like indoctrination would be that your kid goes to a school and all he gets is critical race theory, where whites are by their very nature oppressors and people of color are by their very nature the oppressed.
Right.
Or when you have teachers.
Or you're in communist Russia in the 1980s and you're just, you're indoctrinated with one view.
Or you have teachers in schools who have the gay flags, pride flags in the class, and they want this is absurd, of course. In my judgment, it's diabolical. Where you have the students, I remember, just to give you an example, I remember Buttigieg, the former Secretary of Transportation, who was useless because he thought that everything was racist. The bridge, the highways built here in Detroit, they were racist because they were trying to divide whites from blacks and all this kind of stuff. And his quote unquote husband, the Lord liberate us, his husband, he taught a summer class where he had the students recite some kind of gay oath. That's indoctrination. I mean, you're indoctrinating little kids. You're having them read pornography. You're talking to them about you're depriving them. You're taking away their innocence and so on. That's indoctrination. Because what does a 5-year-old who doesn't even think about sex? What does a 5-year-old or a 7 or a 10-year-old even think about these kind of matters? And you have these teachers coming and telling telling the students you have no business telling the students that you're non-binary and blah, 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 all of that. That's indoctrination, it seems to me. But teaching the students, to develop a critical judgment, to have an understanding, criteria of assessment, and so on at the appropriate time. That's not indoctrination.
It's almost the opposite of indoctrination.
Exactly. Right. So anyway, I'm there right now. Mm-hmm. I'm cautiously optimistic. I like him as his persona. He seems like a good man. He seems affable, friendly.
Yeah. Well, his brother was on several podcasts. I saw him on Piers Morgan, of all places, and he certainly seems like a typical Chicagoan, pretty down to earth guy. I struggle a little bit because I didn't feel he articulated the Catholic faith very well.
Right.
But now everybody is equally.
Well, he was being interviewed by Piers Morgan.
Oh yeah, you should watch that.
But I mean, this is not after he was Pope. This is before.
This is the Pope's brother.
Oh, the Pope, please.
The Pope's brother.
The Pope's brother.
Yeah,
I'm not going to take my stand.
I'm sure Prevost. I'm sure Leo is much more
adept
at articulating the Catholic faith than his brother, and there can be variation in a family between how one understands their faith and can articulate it as opposed to somebody else.
If people who are listening, they should go and look at May 10th, Saturday, May 10th. It's a good address. He gave an address to the College of Cardinals.
Yeah, well, I think for the Protestants, as we talked about the social, for conservative evangelicals, where we certainly meet and lock arms is on the social
Right, but it's
issues.
not just social. I mean, he's giving you a
It's moral.
theological.
It's moral
In my
theological,
judgment, it's biblical.
biblical,
If you go
right?
and you listen to some, again, there has today was actually it's Wednesday. Today was his first general audience,
Hmm.
which I think was a good. It was a good thing. There's also now to me, yeah, he gave an address on this past Monday to in an ecumenical and an interreligious context, and it was okay, but you know, I just think here's the bottom line for me on that, and that is that certainly interreligious dialogue has to be truth oriented. Um, certainly, yes, of course, as Paul says, you want to be so much as is possible be at peace with all men, and so on. But I think sometimes the church has, contrary to its teachings, because Christ is the full and sufficient means of our salvation, and so on. Sometimes there's a sense in which, um, like for instance, when the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue writes a letter, if there's a kind of a holiday, like recently Buddhists and all that,
Hmm.
it creates the impression as if their practices are somehow efficacious, even salvivically
Right.
efficacious, and so it creates a. But even if it doesn't say that, of course,
Hmm.
but it creates the impression, a kind of a indifferentism, and a kind of a
Yeah, I mean,
relatively.
it creates that, just that pluralistic message of we're all good where we're at. Just kind of stay where you're at.
Right.
Everything's
Well,
sort of
again, it doesn't
fine.
say that, but that's the
It
impression
it impresses the idea
because
of
there's no in the
pluralism.
dialogue itself.
Yeah,
It's not truth oriented.
right.
It's not. I always quote in two respects. I quote Ratzinger here, Pope Benedict. One of his last addresses, he said, "Nostra Aetate." Nostra Aetate is the decree on the Church's relation to non uh, non Christians. That's not about ecumenism. It's about relationship between Christians and non Christians. And Ratzinger said he thought Nostra Aetate was a great document, but he said it was too positive towards other religions. It was
Wait,
too
who
positive.
said that?
This was Ratzinger, Benedict.
Ratzinger?
Benedict in his
Benedict, yeah.
one of his last addresses.
Yeah.
He supported Nostra Aetate. I support
Hmm.
Nostra Aetate, but I think it's too positive towards other religions. You see, there are other places in the Vatican II documents,
Hmm.
in Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church, in paragraph 17,
Yeah.
and in other places, and even in well, why would there be a need to evangelize
Right.
if it's all cool? If you just
Yeah. If general revelation is what starts to become something like sufficient
Yes,
means
exactly.
of
So
grace
that's one thing.
for
The other thing
salvation.
is, Ratzinger says, in the context of interreligious dialogue, yes, of course, we come to the dialogue with the full commitment of Christian faith. We want to understand, Ratzinger says, the otherness of the other in his own thinking. But he says this is superficial because at the end of the day, you have to be able to give a justification for the Christian beliefs that you hold to be true. And this is also missing often, it was missing in Francis, since in fact the dialogue has to begin with the presupposition that there are incompatible claims being made here. I often tell my students that if the central claims of Christianity are true, then Islam must be false.
Right.
Must be
Well,
false.
the I'm doing as you know, I'm doing the book on paganism right now, and the early church fathers, think like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, even they're they're willing to grant, obviously, certain degree and kind of general revelation amongst the religions of the nations. They're not saying that God hasn't left or through,
God has not left
given
himself without
grace
witness.
without witness in Acts
Yeah,
17,
right.
but then they're also equally willing to affirm that Satan has sowed deception,
Right,
and
right,
demonic entities have sown deception amongst the nations and
right.
the religions that have developed in the different cultures. And that second piece, I think we're so unwilling to speak these days, right? We want to say, oh, look at all the common grace and general revelation that
Yeah.
God has
Exactly,
given.
exactly.
But we're
Well, we
very
have
unwilling to say, but Satan has come in and sowed
right.
seeds of
Or there,
destruction.
and in fact,
You know,
in many
yeah,
documents of the Church, the Pontifical Council, the what is it for? Anyway, several
yeah,
councils, the International Theological Commission. That's the one I'm thinking of. In their discussion about other religions and all that, they say yes, common grace, general revelation, etc. But let's not ignore that there are in fact falsehoods there,
yeah.
that there are incompatible truth claims.
The wetic
So,
effects of sin are our
exactly.
ability to receive common grace, as
And
well
there's a
as, yeah,
resistance. You resist. Just
suppress
because.
the truth and unrighteousness.
Yeah, you just because there's God bears witness to Himself in general revelation and in Romans 2, the moral order and all that. That doesn't and there's prevenient grace and all that doesn't mean that men don't resist that.
Yeah.
You
I mean,
know,
there's a trend in analytic philosophy of religion right now by atheist or agnostic philosophers to argue that there's this thing, non-resistant non-belief. This is the term that they're using, and the argument is that, oh well, if there is genuine non-resistant non-belief, then this can be used as an argument against
I don't even know
Christianity,
what that
right?
means.
Because God, well, it means that people who reject Christianity are doing it solely because there's not enough evidence,
Right.
right? And
But you can,
they're
that's
not
when
resistant to
look, let's go back.
the
You
gospel
know,
in any sense.
I
Their will is good, and that they're open to Christianity, but they're not resistant in any kind of moral or
But this
willful
is what
way. It's just a purely rational calculation
yeah,
when they
well,
don't see the
I don't
reasons for
believe
it.
that. But
Yeah,
then
no, I
that's
don't believe it
you.
either.
You can go back
Yeah.
to
I
Bertrand
think the
Russell.
argument itself is a way to sort of resist, right? Oh,
Yeah,
let's make an
exactly.
argument,
I
that
remember.
we're not
I remember.
resistant to this.
I remember Bertrand Russell, who was once asked, "Well,
Yes,
what are you
yeah,
going to do when you get to heaven and to the gates of heaven?" And I don't know. I don't remember the exact words that he.
yeah.
What are you going to do?
You didn't not enough evidence, God.
No,
You
and
didn't
that's
give
what
me
he
enough
says. Not enough
evidence.
evidence. So,
Yeah,
but see, to accept that means that intellectually Christianity is not justifiable.
yeah,
You'd have to accept that it's the incapacity of the mind. I don't accept that, but it's all the more reason why you have to engage in apologetics, the necessity of both in an interreligious context and in a more general context. But that's what happens. You see, you get these letters from the Pontifical Council for interreligious dialogue, congratulating Buddhists on whatever their holiday is, and the fact is, there is no critical discussion. Even in our diocese, we may have you get together with Buddhists and Muslims. I put Judaism in a separate category. The church puts Jews in a separate category, not because you can be saved as a Jew, but because you know the Old Testament and all that. But the fact is, you get together. I have nothing against getting together with a Muslim and having dinner with him,
yeah.
but I just or a Buddhist or Baha'i and all that. But then it becomes a social thing, you see,
Right. It's purely social.
and then I just think you begin to that kind of thing just assumes an indifference, a religious relativism, and
Worldview
yeah,
relativism.
and
Yes.
one can, people can say, oh, no, 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 that's
Yeah.
not what I mean, blah blah blah. But the fact is, you're not prepared to say that Islam is false,
Right. Right.
that the central claims of Christianity, if they're true, then that's incompatible with the central claims of Islam. Yes, you can find elements of truth. Islamic theology, they affirm a doctrine of creation, and even that there's one God. Although when you press that, what they mean by oneness is not the same thing that
Yeah.
we as Christians mean by oneness, because uh, we're not Unitarians.
Right.
We think
Yeah.
that God does not exist in solitude, and
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. So
Well, and then on that theological and the idea of theological polemic, I got a good book here that we can recommend.
right,
Ed's
thank you.
latest book, Jesus Christ, Scandal of Particularity, which is exactly
Yeah.
about
Vatican
that.
II,
So
a Catholic
also,
theology of
I'm
religion,
getting through it slowly, but we'll get.
justification and
Yeah.
truth. You see that those two terms,
Yeah.
justification. I'm not talking about theological justification, how you're made righteous with
Right.
God. I'm talking about justifying your beliefs.
Epistemic justification. Right.
Epistemic, and
Yeah.
the nature of truth. You see,
Yeah.
and all of that, in my judgment, is lost. And oftentimes, well, I argue in chapter 5 that it's Francis.
Well, yeah, that was part of the problem with Francis. It
Yeah.
was this, and we talked about that, I think, when we did Fiducia Supplicans. It's
Right,
this sort of downgrading of what we might call propositional.
Right, he
propositional
downgrades that.
claims.
He downgrades.
It's all about
the
experience in
Yes. Okay. So
counter
I'm not against,
theology, which is
but
of
it's
course fine, but you
right.
can't not to the negation or the reduction of the importance of the theological claims
Right.
of the
And that you have
deposit of
to,
the faith.
and that you have to engage in the defense of those propositions, and that you
Yeah.
can't withdraw, the absoluteness of your claims, and that you
Right.
have to be able to say, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Now we live in a culture where people think there are no true or false propositions about religion, theology, even morality. Uh, but I say, if there are no true propositions, there are no false ones. All you have are differences, and nobody's wrong.
Yeah.
That's where we're at.
I mean, it'll be interesting to see now, because I sense that is shifting, and that Leo might be soon working in a Western cultural context that is very different from what Francis was coming into. I was watching a podcast. Glenn Lowry, who's a well-known economist, just retired from Brown University, fairly conservative commentator. He had Robert George and Cornel West on his podcast recently about the universities, the nature of dialogue at the universities, the kind of totalitarianism that has now sort of taken over from. Robert George was lamenting what he called the old liberal relativism of the 90s, where people would just be like, oh, you have your truth, I have mine, but let's just get along. Where now, the attitude is much more like, you're wrong, I'm right. It's much more an absolutist claim, to the point of, cancel culture. We won't even, we don't even want to dialogue.
Well, but no, but that's because they've abandoned,
to
quote Francis Schaeffer, that's because they've escaped from reason.
Escape from reason, right? Reason is no longer even.
Reason is just.
It's all power. It's all power, right?
Exactly. Let me give you one last example before I go.
Yeah.
Some years ago, I was. This is when I was teaching in South Africa. I was on sabbatical, and I made a fundamental mistake. I went to Harvard Divinity School as a visiting scholar, and I was in this class of Francis Schussler Fiorenza. Held a chair in Catholic studies there.
I know.
Anyway, it was a class on theology and rationality, and we were one of the books that the course started with reading which I think is a good book in some ways, although I don't agree with his doctrine of revelation. H. Richard Niebuhr's book, The Meaning of Revelation. Now, the people in that class, the students in that class, graduate students, they were not interested in understanding what are the claims that H. Richard Niebuhr is making here.
Mm-hmm.
All they were interested in was getting, because they assumed that the claims that he was making were just power claims.
Power
You know,
claims.
they've all
Sure.
been shaped by Foucaultian and Nietzschean ideas.
Social theory, all the social
yeah,
theories.
all that stuff. And so
Yeah.
they weren't interested in arguing. They weren't interested in looking at the propositions, the assertions that were being made. And so there was no real discussion. Let's just unveil the power claims behind this work, and that was the end of the conversation. So our culture has escaped from reason. That's why when you go to Charlie Kirk, for instance, when he goes to universities,
Right.
or others when they go to universities to speak, all they do, they get just yelled at by students and blah blah blah, because they've escaped from reason. There's no argument,
Right.
etc.
Yeah.
So,
No, that's right.
but
Well,
I mean, just to bring it back to what
yeah.
we've been talking.
Yeah, bring it back
positive.
to Leo
I'm
here.
positive. I'm optimistic, but I'm not optimistic because I think, oh, this is just Francis 2.0. My optimism would
you wouldn't be optimistic.
No, that wouldn't do it. I don't want a Francis 2.0.
Yeah, right.
Give me a John Paul II, or give me a Benedict XVI. Okay.
Now, I mean, John Paul was a very charismatic. I mean, Benedict was more of an academic, right?
Yes.
Personality-wise.
John Paul,
maybe we don't know with Leo yet. I mean, he seems to sort of have he certainly has the missionary background.
Right.
I guess we don't know, but
he looks affable. He looks, I saw photos of J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio and their wives going up to him.
Right.
It's interesting. I said to a friend of mine, I said, notice that European royalty, they knew how to present themselves before the pontiff. You see, the women curtsied, they kissed the ring of the Pope. Even the king, he bowed before Francis, before Leo. Francis wouldn't tolerate that because whatever. Here's another thing, just in terms of continuity.
So Leo allowed for the more formal.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The etiquette of the etiquette of meeting the Pope. These are people whose countries, at least nominally, are considered Catholic.
Right. Spain,
the Queen of the Netherlands was she from Argentina. She's Catholic. The Belgian king, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So these are people that understand. Hey, you're not just coming before, the pastor. You're coming before the man who is, in the Catholic mind, is a successor of Peter, the 267th Pope, and so on and so on and so on. But here's one last thing, and that is, Leo began very differently than Francis. He wore the traditional garb of a pope when he came out.
People had pointed that out.
When he came out there,
ceremonial garb,
and then also he wore that the garb that affirmed his universal authority.
Mm-hmm.
When Francis came out, it was buonasera, good evening, and it's very, very, very different. So even there's a discontinuity. But
and maybe I think people are seeing the writing on the wall. I mean, there is this cultural shift back towards the tradition, right? I mean, and Protestants are living through it in the sense of we're seeing, either a retrieval in sort of the sense of retrieval theology, right? We have to recapture
Right. The ressourcement. We have to go back to the
and there's
authoritative.
that in the Catholic,
Yeah. Right.
and then also in the evangelical world. But you got a lot of evangelicals who are converting, as you are well aware, and I'm sure you're pleased by, to Catholicism. I would say a lot. We don't know the numbers. We get high profile conversions.
Right. High profile conversion.
Or Eastern Orthodoxy even. Right. So there is this sense of we've had enough of postmodernism. We've had enough of relativism. We've had enough of this downgraded, decrepit sort of culture that just produces, we want, or even if like this within the Catholic Church, this retrieval of a reaffirmation of the Latin Mass, right, and so on and so forth, which I know contentions that could be contended, but there is a sense of like just desiring the tradition, right?
All right, so I have to go, but
but that was good.
But in any case, I mean, I'm positive,
cautiously optimistic.
I'm cautiously optimistic. I like him. He's I mean, just personality wise, and I keep listening, reading some of the addresses that he's given recently. And as we said, there's no history. He doesn't have. It's not like he has. It's not like with John Paul, who had all kinds of the Lublin lectures and all kinds of things that he wrote, and of course Ratzinger, who was prolific, and so on and so on. So we have to just let's listen, and I'm open to listening, and open to seeing where things go. I'm optimistic,
it's not bad to have Pope Bob from Chicago.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. So, all right, Ed. Always a pleasure to talk to you, brother. Yeah, God bless.
Take care. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.